Me. Oh, yes. Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to this incredibly interesting chat about an extremely topical subject. I think we're going to start out with a few comments from Maha Yahya, who is the director of the Carnegie Midi Center, and Maha Yahya. And I'm going to hand over to you, and then I will introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Liz. I'm delighted that you're going to be coordinating this panel discussion. For those of you who don't know, this is the Liz Sly, the famous Liz Sly, veteran journalist at the Washington Post. I would like to welcome everybody to this first panel in a series on the Centennial of Lebanon that we're doing in partnership with the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. The idea of these panels is to be forward-looking. Lebanon is, as of September 1st, 100 years old. And we don't need to go into the context and the situation that Lebanon finds itself today with a total economic meltdown, a pandemic, political deadlock, and a catastrophic explosion that damaged half the city and has cost people's lives, hundreds of lives lost, thousands injured, and the losses in terms of the financial losses in the billions of dollars. So all of this is quite catastrophic. Our hope of that in those four panels, we will actually try to be forward-looking and think together about what is the Lebanon that we would like to see, where are the key junctures, key issues that need to be looked at, and is there a way forward, or what ways forward? There are ways. What ways forward out of the deadlock we find itself in? This first one is on the political context. The next one will be, these will be every Tuesday for the next 4 weeks at the same time. The first one is on the politics. The second one will be on the economy. The third will be on security and freedoms. And the fourth will be on greening the economy, environment, etc. Malte, I thank you for the partnership on this. It's not the first time we've partnered on joint projects, joint initiatives together, and it's always been fantastic. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Maha. Thank you, Liz, also, and Joseph, Carmen, Jean, Mohanad, also. Thank you very much for making it possible. I remember when we, a long time ago, when we started talking about how could we, what could we do at this special month. Also, of course, like we all realized the situation will worsen, of course, but we all could not imagine that we will now gather together, meet together after this horrible blast, this catastrophe. To the Carnegie Middle East Center, it's also really my pleasure, after our Syria-Iraq program already cooperated with you, that we can do here in Beirut, also like our first big event. And you said it already, like we are looking forward. I think it will be an interesting month, not only regarding our following parts, like the three other parts that will follow the political discussion today, but also in general, the developments in the country. For us as a German organization, this is of course also the time to look at Lebanon with different eyes, also to question, of course, like also policies, approaches of the past. I think this is something no one can ignore anymore. And so I think this is really, especially for our guests from abroad, from Europe, from Germany, I think this is really now the time also to listen to Lebanese experts. I'm really happy that you are all on board, and I'm really looking forward to your input. Thank you very much also to our audience for joining. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So, yes, the subject today, Gordian Knot, is extremely appropriate for Lebanon. These are very these are dark and sad days that we're having at the moment, and it's clear something has to change, but what and how? Nobody has yet figured out that puzzle. Now, the Gordian knot was an extremely complicated knot, but legend has it, whoever could untie it would get to control all of Asia. Alexander the Great got very intrigued by this knot, and he tried to untie it, but he couldn't. So, because he was a very clever man, he just took out his sword and sliced the knot in two. Now, this is really the central question facing Lebanon at the moment. Do you untie the knot, perhaps slowly, preserving all the threads, or do you just slice it up, cut it up, destroy the system, reform or revolution? The prize for whoever figures that out is $11 billion in CEDRA funds, 10 billion from the IMF, and perhaps more going forward from the IMF as well. So I'm going to introduce the panelists and then start asking them questions. First of all, we have Joseph Bahout, who is the director of the Issam Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. We have Carmen Geha, Associate Professor of Public Administration, Organization and Leadership at the AUB. Jean Kassir, who is Managing Director and co-founder of Megaphone, which is an opposition news outlet. And of course, Maha, who has just introduced herself, doesn't need introduction, the Director of the Carnegie Middle Center. So I'm going to start the questions by going to Jean and asking him, reform or revolution? Can the system be reformed, or should it be completely overturned and no vestiges of it remain?
I mean, the answer was pretty clear and loud on the 17th of October. It's a radical change that people are demanding. No more reforms and attempt to save, basically, the system in both its economic and political structure. After the 4th of August, we're also at a different threshold of what kind of radical change we're demanding today. We're no longer within a framework where we're in opposition and there is basically a legitimate party or parties in power. A lot of us are defining this as a war because very clearly after the 4th of August, it was proven to everybody that people's lives in this country don't matter, and everything is about that. So talking about reform is not just something that is no longer acceptable morally and politically, but it's no longer possible because it's been tried and tested for several years. And several attempts basically were made to try to reshuffle the order of the system politically based on new sectarian dynamics, based on new regional dynamics, and so on and so forth. And the result is there, which is a total failure at all levels, and basically a country that is striving to continue to exist.
So I'm going to turn to Joe now, Joe Bahout, and I'd like to know what does the international community, and of course especially France, which is taking the lead on trying to sort out Lebanon's problems, what do they think about the idea of having a total revolution here? And would it be something they would accept or want? And what is it that France is trying to achieve here at the moment?
Yeah, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Carnegie Middle East. Thank you, Maha, for hosting us. It's of course always timely subject to discuss. I mean, this question of sectarianism and power sharing in Lebanon. And by the way, this is already an interesting observation I would make, that in fact we are talking about the necessity or the feasibility of cutting the Gordian knot of power sharing, whereby in fact we are mainly discussing sectarianism and political sectarianism. I think in this session, power sharing is just one way of distribute power, and sectarianism is one way of doing it. So I think we shouldn't confuse both. I hope that we will probably be aware of that during this session. The second observation I would make before answering your question is that I mean, everybody in Lebanon, as Jean said, in Lebanon, but also abroad, is very conscious that, to put it at least cautiously, this system cannot go on anymore the way it used to. Now, to jump from there to say that I mean, a revolution is needed, which needs to still be defined. I mean, what kind of revolution, what kind of new political system, How do we get there is, I think, the debate. But the acknowledgement by everyone here and abroad, of course, here, as Jean said, and Maha, we are feeling the pain day to day, but abroad they are, I mean, understanding analytically that this country has probably reached the limit of the functioning of its system. The necessity is here, but I think that once you've said that, the array of answers is enormous and very wide. Now, Jean has mentioned something, for example, and in your metaphor or in your reminder of Alexander the Great, he couldn't untie the knot, he had to cut it. First of all, the question in Lebanon is endless, and it has been raised since the 60s, but now with acuity today. Should we cut it or untie it? I think the question is still it's in the air, it's up in the air. Meaning, to frame it differently, do we need a reform or a revolution in the country? Jean brought the answer that, or part of the answer brought back by, or put forward by the civil society in Lebanon, saying we need to cut the Gordian knot, whereby others are still working on reform it, on untie it smoothly. And this is a huge debate and shouldn't be taken lightly. The second aspect of this question is, can you do it? I mean, is the balance of power today, to be very frank and candid and cold analytically, is the balance of power in the country amenable to that? Meaning, to be very provocative maybe here, and I will hear maybe Carmen on that, is the party that, let's call it this way, the deconfessionalization party in Lebanon, a majoritarian party or not? I mean, this is a true question that we have, that we need to raise. Maybe the party of sectarians in the country, all united, is stronger than the party that would like to see the system completely jump outside confessionalization or sectarian politics. Now, very quickly, abroad, what is considered? Here again, I would caution versus or against certain simplifications. First of all, there's not one abroad, there's not one West, there's not one international community towards that question. Every stakeholder has its own wishes and its own, let's say, set of injunctions. For example, if the French, who are sometimes accused, rightly maybe, for having, if not invented, but entertained and consolidated the sectarian system in Lebanon in 1936, and then in the 40s during the mandate, probably today they consider, or analytically at least, when you go in political science circles or policy analyst circles in France, you have this acknowledgement that we have to exit confessionalism, as they say in France. But once you have said that, you don't know exactly how to do it and if really Lebanese want to do it. Now, if you take the issue from further on the Atlantic, I mean, in the US and etc., I don't think, frankly, that they are concerned with such questions. In fact, what they are seeking is essentially a change in the balance of power within this system, namely shifting or twisting the balance of power from the people who are the forces who are dominating it today to the people who used to dominate it, or who they wish could dominate it again or newly. This is not exactly the change that I think civil society is bearing. I think that this question has to be addressed locally, domestically in Lebanon by Lebanese, with probably the limits of the balance of power that Lebanon is offering us. And here, I think it's a call I'm making here for Lebanese not to bet on international pressures in this regard. I mean, for these ends of changing the system and recrafting the system, because whatever benevolent or however benevolent others are towards our country, they will probably encourage a change that still opens avenues for them to, let's say, penetrate, manipulate, and I'm using it without, I mean, pejorative meaning, to manipulate, because everybody manipulates in politics, and to have a system that is amenable to their interests. I think we should tackle this question and confront it on a pure Lebanese level. Now, very quickly, if you're asking me about the French initiative, we'll talk about it later on. I think it's too unjust for the French initiative itself to see in it something very ambitious, namely a recrafting of the political pact in Lebanon, although Emmanuel Macron has stated that very hastily in a sentence. But today, I think all what France is trying to do is to trigger or to awaken the Lebanese to the sense of urgency and to trigger certain minimal reforms that will maybe prolong the lifeline of the moribund Lebanon that we have in front of our eyes, and waiting for better times and better days regionally and internationally, where maybe one could wish the big questions of the future could be open. I think that putting in the French initiative more than that is, first of all, to my mind, and I think I know what I'm talking about, unjust and completely unjustified. And it's also a way of let's say, loading this French initiative much more than it is bearing in fact itself. So I think that it's not nothing, but it's not also, as certain analysts or writers or journalists have expressed it, the start of a new era of French mandate over Lebanon. Neither France is willing or aiming or able to embark in such a mandate. And I think that the international system today is really very far from rejuvenating or rehabilitating the mandates as we have seen them.
So thank you. I'm going to put that very interesting question that you raised to Carmen next, and I'm going to combine it with a question from a reader, from a watcher, somebody who's watching from the audience. Carmen, first of all, do you believe, you're in touch with a lot of students, you mingle a lot with a lot of the young revolutionaries, do you believe that there is majority support in this country for a non-confessional politics? I know that when I interview people and I talk to them, a lot of them say all of them means all of them, but the guy I support isn't one of them. And then the question from the audience, which kind of goes with that, are there any ongoing credible initiatives to establish a coherent, homogeneous and strong opposition that could have a chance in the next elections? That seems to be a very central question as well. Wherever the majority support lies for what kind of politics, we haven't seen the opposition or the protesters yet come up with a coherent alternative to the current system. And without one, the system obviously survives.
Okay, thank you. So let me start by, since my colleagues played a bit with the philosophy and you started with this, Liz, as well. What if the Gordian Knot in 2020 untied itself? Because I think the year 2020, not just for Lebanon, has shown that regimes fall for much less than what we've experienced it. And by regimes, I don't only mean nation states, but like the health regime in the world in the face of a pandemic. So I think we didn't entertain the idea that if we will slice up the Gordian Knot, or if we untie it slowly by slowly, revolution versus reform, I think we never fathomed the idea of it breaking down on its own. Let's just imagine for a second that the way out and breaking this cycle is by actually seeing them falter. I think what happened after August 4 ought to change the conversation from majority and minority. Today, even if a majority or a minority is in rule, no matter how you want to frame it, they don't have the right to store explosive using people's bodies as human shields. So I think the conversation around the Centennial and August 4th, if we want to start imagining a different possibility, and perhaps this is my activism or my trauma, is imagining as if they've already fallen down. And I want to say that it's not only my trauma, because actually my first book was on path dependence and critical junctures. I argued that Lebanon continues to be a resilient political system. Mish people are resilient. The political system is resilient in that at every juncture, it is able to enshrine itself and adapt and learn and keep the main pillars of sectarian rule. that is not only about sectarian institutions, but about warlords making deals over dead bodies. And so what I'm trying to say is that I do have, I studied this for many, many years, but what if this was a critical juncture that was different? And not because we're special in Lebanon, but because they've lost a lot of support and a lot of money and a lot of legitimacy. And even if only a minority of us are demanding rights, the majority should answer to the minority. They can't kill us all and pollute our air and our water and say that this is what the majority wants. Which gets me to the question around elections and options. I think it's very important as well not to get into this narrative that there is not a homogeneous leadership. This is a country that assassinates political opposition. It's not easy. This is also a country where we don't have any way of learning politics. So we learn it on the streets and we make mistakes and we drive through sometimes the municipal campaign, sometimes parliamentary. Sometimes we think, no, the most important thing is media, what Jean is working on. We go back and say, actually, no, maybe we need to think about this in a gendered perspective. We don't learn politics anywhere, neither in school, neither in the media, neither in political parties. So I think that we have to read the protest movements with that kind of tolerance in mind. It is not easy, and I'm not sure it's the best strategy to have a homogeneous group of people and say, here, this is the people who want to oppose the system. Now, please kill us all, figuratively or literally. So I think we have to think about this a little bit differently. I think that the critical juncture that will prepare us for an election, because we do have a peaceful transition of power here, elections, right? But elections should be free and fair. Elections can't be done like a David and Goliath, correct? So how do we get there? I think that the next 2, 3, 6 months are critical in terms of building people's agency, because path dependence and critical junctures fails to consider people's agency, people deciding and building their own sense confident that they can fight the fight and they can live between now and the next election. That's why for me, I want to think that the aid and the recovery can challenge Goliath, not just by showing how the top is corrupted, but also unpacking construction agencies, banks, NGOs. They have ways. The sectarian system is an octopus. I want to think that if we can survive and work together in the next 3 to 6 months, then we will have a minimum sense of agency to fight in the next election. And I want to consider that the knot is untying itself, that they failed, that it's like a wound that's cut for the whole world to see. And I want us to start looking at it in that way because it becomes more manageable.
Thank you. So Maha, I'd like to turn to you next. I mean, one of the problems that with the protest movement and the creation of a credible opposition that could counter an opposition is that leaders don't emerge. I mean, Carmen mentioned that, the regime, the state is inclined to knock them down, discredit them before they even emerge. But it's been nearly a year now, and we don't have any credible opposition leaders, credible opposition voices who could be used to draw a crowd. I think of one revolution, complete overturn of the system that I covered, which was South Africa in 1994. And, there were 2 great visionary leaders who led the country out of the wilderness and enforced the new South Africa on each of their communities. Those leaders don't exist in Lebanon. Why not?
Thank you, Liz. And thank you to Joe, Carmen, and Jean for joining this panel and for very interesting comments so far. I would respond by saying, I think the structure today is very different from South Africa. This is a different, we're talking about politics in a very different time frame. I would argue that this issue of leadership, while it is important, it's not the only thing that will untie this Gordian knot. I agree with what Carmen was saying, which is we are at a critical juncture. I recently wrote a piece called All Fall Down, where I was looking at how the key pillars in Lebanon, the 4 out of 5 key pillars, are crumbling in one way or the other, are unraveling. And even the 5th pillar, which is the security one, is also in question today. So the issue of a leadership emerging, I would even venture to argue, you're looking at two people, and I don't want to point fingers, but 2 of our panelists here are very active on the ground, and they do have a not necessarily a following, but they do have a voice and influence, and are working very hard to build up this kind of an opposition that you're talking about. I know a number of initiatives today that are taking place, and I think Jean can talk even more about at least some of the initiatives he's involved in, where people are coming together to try and create a unified opposition. This takes time. This takes time, but I think the trick is to be ready for the elections, which hopefully will take place in maybe a year. If you know, technically they're supposed to take place in 2 years, but assuming they take place within a year, where you're able to push at least or bring a new leadership into the system that can trigger a certain change. At the end of the day, this is a country where the balance of power is such where no, you cannot slash through the Gordian knot, unfortunately. If you try and slash through the Gordian knot, you end up in a civil conflict, at best, actually. So the other path, the other option that we have is to keep at this knot, but meanwhile work at through the institutions of political change and try and push for a peaceful transfer of power. I wouldn't even call it transfer of power, frankly, because it doesn't even apply in this country. But I think that if there were elections to happen today, I would, you know, be as bold to say, you know, venture to say that quite a few of the current, a good percentage of the current parliament would change. They would change. It would change hands. We're already seeing how some of the political leadership has already lost a significant part of its following. Now, all of this is a slice through this particular moment. We also have to put this in a context of a disintegration at every single level, with increasing levels of violence, possible violence, and the current political parties are the most well-suited in deploying these instruments of violence. So is this going to push people towards to go back to their sectarian instinct? I'm not sure. And I think, again, this idea that what was possible before August 4th has shifted dramatically after August 4th, i.e. after the catastrophe that we saw in Beirut, I think applies across quite a bit of the country and quite a bit of the leadership. The discontent that we're seeing is profound and it's very present. Attempts to build on it are very much there. Will they succeed? I think is a different story, but I don't think we should wait for a Nelson Mandela to emerge or a Gandhi to emerge in Lebanon. This is a different time, or a Jamal Abdel Nasser to bring someone closer to home. This is a different time, and a different politics works differently in this day and age, I would say. And I think we're struggling kind of between the traditional instruments, the traditional institutions of politics, and the kind of horizontal alternative approaches to politics that we have at hand today. I'll stop right here.
So Jean, yes, Maha suggested that you tell us about some of the initiatives to forge a coherent kind of opposition politics. What is happening out there? It's very hard to see it if it's happening. What we see is a lot of divisions among the protesters. They're pretty much as divided as the politicians, except that the politicians are in their chairs and the protesters are on the streets.
Yeah, I'll start maybe by trying to describe what I believe was the systemic problem of the opposition pre-October 17 and why we're here today, and then elaborate a bit on the attempts that are being done now to organize the opposition and why I believe they're also extremely challenging to be done after October 17. I think one of the key issues that was symptomatic of this opposition since 2011 up until 2019 was the fact that we were constantly reactive, in a sense, to crises that were being imposed by the establishment. And there wasn't really any work on building political structures, on building syndicates, basically organizing people around their political interests and their material interests first and foremost. So we were left with sort of ad hoc movements that happened on 2014, when the parliament extended illegally its mandate, then 2015, the garbage crisis. Then we tried several attempts to run for elections, but it was always without really accumulating basically work within grassroots structures that were providing people with real alternatives to basically fight for their immediate interests. This happened very late, in my opinion, and this started forming after October 17. So maybe you can imagine that there was, I mean, a battle that needed to be fought, but we were unequipped at the time where it happened. So unfortunately, very, very soon, a few months after October 17, we noticed that there wasn't the ability to really be able to derive roadmaps and clarity for people who went on the ground. And we saw very quickly that the numbers shrinked without necessarily the anti-establishment sentiment and the sympathy for the revolution shrinking, on the contrary. So that's sort of a paradox that we're in today. Today, what's happening is two kinds of dynamics that I believe are complementary. There's one which is trying to create sort of large tables that are extremely encompassing and that bring everybody on the table. I think this is extremely important, but at the same time, we shouldn't fall into the illusion of unity or homogeneity, because that's absolutely not the case. We know the fault line that divides opposition, and it's extremely important to have the maturity to acknowledge them while being able to work together in a constructive manner on the points that we agree on. The second dynamic is one that I also find extremely interesting and hence complementary, which is people and groups basically getting together along ideological, political, and programmatic lines, sort of. The left or the new left, quote unquote, being able, in a sense, to resemble each other and work together. The new groups that are more liberal. So I think that this goes in the right direction, because the second main endemic issue of this opposition pre-October 17 was the lack of clarity when it comes to political ideas, to programs, and to roadmaps. And I'm going to be very blunt. I mean, there are some fault lines in the countries that need to be answered. Where do we stand regarding Hezbollah? Not only Killun Yani Killun, because that's the baseline, that's the benchmark, that's the starting point, if you want. But there's the elephant in the room. And this is something there is still a lot of ambiguity in how to deal with this question. Economically, we are not agreeing, in a sense, on, if you want, the roadmap to get out of this economic crisis. We have very clear differences between the left and between more neoliberal, if you want, parties or groups that are trying to, in a sense, reiterate the same policies that have been applied in the past. So there are very clear distinctions and differences. It doesn't mean we cannot work together, but I think it goes in the right direction to start defining them. And when it comes to, I mean, what Carmen said, I completely agree with her. We should of course be critical to ourselves, but we shouldn't blame ourselves that much, because we're operating in a country where young people's first and foremost concern is to make a living and to be able to sort out their ways. Very few of us had both the luxury and the necessary condition to be involved in politics, and the increasing majority of our comrades have no option but to leave the country. So that's the reality we're in. It's not just a matter of bad tactics and bad strategizing. It's also an extremely impeding, if you want, economic and political structure that doesn't really allow those alternative structures to emerge.
So, yes, asking Joe this question about, you have, you have divisions among the political elites, you have divisions among protesters. There's sort of no unity any way you look. And then in the international community, you also have divided and competing interests in Lebanon. You have Iran with Hezbollah, and Iran's not going to let Hezbollah go. America seems very determined to push for reforms that include getting rid of Hezbollah's weapons, and which then is a complete change to the system. And somebody mentioned that it's important for the Lebanese there should be a Lebanese solution. That was what you said. But can you have a Lebanese solution when there's so many international powers with stakes here and interests here and allies here, and they are at odds with each other as well?
In short, the answer would be no, of course, because the country's history showed that it's a very extroverted country. It's a very, it's a country that is very much tied and entangled with the regional and international evolutions and dynamics, of course. But having said that, doesn't solve the issue. I mean, there remains a huge margin for Lebanese to craft their own understandings, at least at a minimal level. Let me get back to this idea of, I mean, several things that have been said on majority, minority, smooth reform or gradual reform versus sudden change and leap into something new all of a sudden and etc. Look, okay, let's agree. I mean, let's say where everybody's agreeing and where the disagreements start. Now, everybody's agreeing that this kind of political arrangement within which political sectarianism is the pillar or a part, but it's not alone the definition of the system, cannot work anymore. Okay, this is the agreement. Now, if you say that the system has reached its end and it cannot function anymore, and it is on a critical crossroad, okay, as Maha said, as we all said. And we embark on this famous foundational Congress or founding Congress that some people are calling for and some other people are fearing, this famous Mu'tamar Ta'sisi. It's funny because at the same time when, for example, Hezbollah is suspected of calling for a Mu'tamar Ta'sisi, most of the people are afraid that this is an attempt at taking over, at changing the system to their benefit and etc. But in fact, when we say we need this country to change and to be recrafted and refounded, we are calling for a Mu'tamar Ta'sisi also. So we need to know what we want exactly. Let's assume we go to this foundational Congress today. I mean, realistically, here I'm a pure analyst. I'm not speculating, and I'm not doing politics here. I'm not a politician. I'm not a political activist during this hour. We go to a Mu'tamar Ta'sisi today. We know the country. We know each other. We know who is whom and who is talking about what. You will have three positions on the table of this Mu'tamar Ta'sisi or foundational Congress. A first position that will say, we are happy with the system as it is, but we want to revise the shares of the cake, okay? We don't want it half-half, we want it three tiers, we want it, etc. Fine, this is the musical chair game that Lebanon has been playing since its inception, since we are talking about the Centennial. Okay, this is one option. It's to say, okay, we stay within the consociational democratic system, which is not an anathema as such, okay? These systems are applied in countries that are working, like, I don't know, Nigeria, Holland, Belgium, and etc. Fine. We can stay there and revise the games, revise the number of chairs, the distribution of power, and etc. And then we'll get into very tricky details about why you should have more than others because you're stronger and etc., which leads you to the game of the balance of power. Now, the second part of Lebanese or a second group will come and say, we want to completely abolish anything sectarian and jump into a complete desectarianized system. This force has been existing in Lebanon. It's not new. Carmen Geha, Maha Yahya, Jean Kassir, Joseph Bahout, etc. are not the first ones to claim for that. Since the 50s and the 60s, you have sometimes more potent force than we are that claimed it and wanted it. The national movement in the 70s wanted this. They couldn't get it. They went into a war, and then at the end of the war, they had to accept a repatching up of the communitarian system in the shape of the Taif Agreement. So these people will come and say, the best solution, and probably some of us will be in this group, is to jump tomorrow into something completely asectarian, dissectarian, and etc. The others will say, okay, fine, you're part of the game, but what do you represent exactly? Do you want to do it the revolutionary way or the reformist way? Win elections and do it. And then you'll have the third part that we are hearing increasingly since 1, 2, 3 years, that also has been present in the history of the country. Let's not fool ourselves. It was present since the inception of the country. for example, Emil Edde and others didn't believe in Greater Lebanon, okay? They were advocating smaller Lebanon. Today, people will tell you, okay, the system is not working anymore. Let's acknowledge that sectarian identities and primordial ties are something we can't go beyond. Let's fix it in the constitution and the construction of the country, and let's go towards federalization or confederalization. This is something you hear. It's not something I'm inventing. So when these three groups will sit on the table, okay, it's not an intellectual conference. It's a political conference. So everybody will count the troops that they have and the forces that they have, the majority that they have. If it's not numbers, it's weapons. If it's not weapons, it's money. If it's not money, it's international backing. So this is what I meant when I said, okay, fine, we all know that we need to change the system, but should we do it in a radical manner, in a black or white manner, or a reformist gradual manner? I don't have the answer, but I know that it's under discussion within the groups that Jean Kassir has mentioned. And also the second thing is, are we able today to impose the option that we think is best for the country? So, I mean, if we want to talk politics here, real politics, okay, we need to take these into account. Now, we know what we want, maybe. First of all, who is we? This is the first question. Even in the revolution, I'm sorry to say it, and you know it. I mean, Jean knows it, Carmen knows it, I know it, Maha knows it, and you know it, Liz, as a reporter. The people, I mean, the public or the crowds of October 17 are not on, I mean, they are not asking or claiming or shouting the same slogans. I mean, of course, they want a functional state, okay? Now, after that, they break up, and Jean Kassir was candid and frank enough to say that there are divergences. What I think should be done today, and here I'm talking about the other part of the country, the part that is refusing the political system today. First, they should acknowledge their differences. They should talk about them without, I mean, hiding behind their fingers, and organize these differences in a sort of national congress or a very wide agora where they would put their projects side by side and talk about them and enlighten the general public about them, and also elaborate the leading figures of tomorrow. If you don't do that, frankly, I can't think about a way where this force will sit at the table with the big crocodiles and the big dinosaurs of the political system that, I'm sorry, Carmen, are far from being dead. And unfortunately, we are seeing them still alive and kicking. And we are the dead. We are the dead walking today in the city. They are far from being dead. Maybe some would say that the French initiative have rejuvenated them. Maybe, but maybe tomorrow an Iranian-American deal will rejuvenate them, another part of them again, and et cetera, et cetera. If we don't do this kind of homework, okay, an explosion or COVID or the economic collapse will not make you and me powerful enough to upend the system and change its nature just all of a sudden, because conceptually we have agreed that this system is dead. The system is dead, maybe, but the caretakers of the system are still powerful.
So yes, the system is dead, but the caretakers are powerful. The powerful ones are still there, and they still have power. They have more money, more access to weapons than any of the ordinary people do. I'd like to ask you, Carmen, do you have a sense of how far these leaders would go to stay in power? And yeah, I mean, and could this push for change push the country to civil war? It certainly wouldn't be the first time that change has produced demands or requests for change have ended up in conflict in Lebanon.
Yeah, the politicians don't have any problem going to the end of the world to get what they need. You said that there were divisions among political elite. I don't agree with you. I think power sharing requests consensus, and they govern by consensus, and they're happy to kill as many dead bodies until we say, please, no more, we can't take it, make a deal and get us out of the carnage that we're in. And I think that the conversation that we're having today troubles me a little bit. And I didn't say that they're dead and we're strong. And I said that this is a critical juncture. Perhaps the knot is untying, because this same panel, we could have had the same discussion about the same topics prior to August 4. What August 4 does is really break open the wound and show how much they're willing to go to cover each other, using our bodies and our schools and our churches and our loved ones as human shields. I am all for the discussion about real politics and how we prepare for the next election, but I don't think that it's possible for any of us to stand on our own 2 feet. What John was saying is very real. I've published about this in Middle East Journal around counter-narrative co-optation and outright oppression. People lose their jobs. We don't have a space to meet. You do politics in your volunteer time because we don't have political parties. I think the difference in this panel, having it after August 4th, is the following. We are at a critical juncture. It's not a conceptualization, it's a reality, because we're just lucky survivors of the blast. Let's break down this critical juncture. It's made up of phases, but also certain struggles. The first struggle I want to put on the table, I agree with my colleagues, we have to think about elections, we have to be united, but I think as well that it's mistaken to say that there's not an opposition. People took to the streets, they demanded revolution. We all can't be political experts. I trust my colleagues to sit on a table and reach an agreement, but there are other levels of the fight. There are other ways to also attack this clientelistic system, and that we get attacked by it. After the Beirut blast, we live with no rooftops. I'm talking sewage, health, schools, hospital beds, primary healthcare centers, electricity. So if I want to get to the next election on my 2 feet, I think the next fight is not only about entering into this binary of what kind of state we need, which we could continue having, and it can take months and weeks and years, and I trust that we will reach an agreement. Why shouldn't we? I think that we all love this country and we deserve to live well. We've been through literally into a war and back, and so I have faith in that process. I don't have faith that in the next 3 to 6 months that the political class, who are not divided actually at all, will not hide all the evidence, fake the investigation, steal all the funding, go and be a partner with the World Bank and put the interest of private investors over the interest of people in Ashrafiyya and Karantina. This is how they buy votes, and this is how they present themselves as saviors. The model of healthcare after the Civil War made us reach into a point where we don't have enough hospital beds, because they agreed to privatize healthcare and make sure that we don't have any preventative way of controlling corona. I see that the faces of my colleagues aren't very happy with this discussion. I understand that you want to talk about real politics, and I am very happy to engage. This was my book and my PhD, but I also understood that you wanted to think of ways out, and one way out is not just in opposing, because I think that we have a very diverse and strong opposition of people that put their sweat and blood to create newspapers and to talk and to meet and to host. I think what we lack is a mechanism to make sure that the recovery restores a minimum sense of political agency and dignity so that we can vote better. And so that's where I think the next level of politics is. Because we can't vote better if we are insulted, if we have to stand in line to get medicine, if people's medication is triangulated by 3 different sources, if we don't have databases, not just around elections and programs.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Maha to ask a question about the elephant in the room, which is you really can't have a discussion about Lebanon at the moment without talking about Hezbollah, which doesn't control Lebanon like some people like to say, but it is undeniably pretty much the most powerful force in Lebanon. And this is a divide that cuts across the elites, the ones in power now, and it cuts across the protesters. Whether or not you want to keep Hezbollah the way it is, whether you want to abolish Hezbollah completely or change it in some way as part of the system. And yes, is there a solution to all these other aspects of the problem in Lebanon we've been discussing that also does not include changing the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon?
I don't think it's up to, I mean, it's not something that you can impose on Hezbollah. There has to be an engagement with Hezbollah for us to be, I mean, at the end of the day, this is a political party in this country that has a significant number of votes, and on top of that is armed. So let's just, it is the elephant in the room, but it's also a reality that we're all living. Before I get into the question of particularly Hezbollah and the role of Hezbollah, I just want to endorse what Carmen was saying, but also to say that politics is being played in very different ways. Jean talked a bit about this, Carmen has talked a bit about this. I think there is quite a considerable base today for alternative political parties to emerge, and they've already started emerging. But we have to remember, this is not something that happens overnight, particularly when you're facing a catastrophic economic situation, which makes it incredibly hard for people to go full-time into politics, even when they choose to. And Jean talked about this. Someone like Jean, who's very politically active, has been politically active for many years, since he was a university, a student at the university, if not earlier, he can talk about himself. But if Jean were to elect today to go full-time into politics and do nothing else, it would be impossible for him. As a young man who's starting out in a situation of a complete economic collapse, it would be impossible. And he's one of the more lucky ones. I mean, there are, if you look at the countless of the situation today in Lebanon, actually everybody on this panel is to some extent privileged. We can sit and talk about this, and we do have the luxury of actually even being able to discuss this publicly in this way. So I think there is space, this coming down on the opposition to say it hasn't given birth to anything. Actually, it's given birth to a lot. But it will not need time to coalesce, and it is coalescing. You have different groups coming. It will need time to emerge into a serious channel, and the venues, everything we do is political. So when they say politics is also personal, or the personal is also political, I think this very much applies here. Coming back to Hezbollah and leading from this, I think the fact that Hezbollah is no longer a taboo. It's very much part of the conversation. It has to be part of the conversation, because at the end of the day, you cannot have a reform of the political system without having a conversation with the biggest and most powerful political force, political and military force in the country. And this is not about them having hijacked the country. I don't think that, I think this is an oversimplification by saying that they control everything in Lebanon. So to my mind, it's not about forcing a change on them. It's actually working with them to have a change in their political behavior. But I think more importantly, frankly, the issue of Hezbollah is not a national one. It's not simply a Lebanese problem. Hezbollah is a regional force. It has an international backer. It was part of the war in Syria. It has networks in Iraq, in addition to Iran, of course, and in Yemen and in other places. This is not an issue that's going to be resolved locally in some, discussion with between the political parties and the opposition here. Any kind of new rethinking of the system along the lines that Joe was mentioning, any conversation about opening up the power sharing system is de facto going to be part of a larger conversation, whether we like it or not, that has to do with what kind of regional political settlement is going to happen in this region. That also includes Syria, that also includes Iraq. It's unfortunately, this is where we are. We're part and parcel of a much larger political game. So I think in terms of agency as Lebanese, and this is where, I come back to both Carmen and Jean and the work they're doing on the ground to at least build up an opposition force to say there is an opposition that's willing to move the country in a different direction. but there also needs to be this kind of a bigger chapeau, if you want.
So thank you. I'm going to ask what might be the last question here to Jean, which is an audience question with one of mine combined together. Issam asks, what about federalism? Is that the alternative if you can't move away from the current existing system into a more secular and democratic system in the country as a whole? Is federalism, decentralization, communities running themselves the answer? I hear that, but I don't see how that doesn't just duplicate the confessionalism and sectarianism that already exists.
I mean, there's what you mean between federalism and decentralization, because federalism has been in the history of this country sort of suggested in a very sectarian / geographic setting, in a sense, where each sect, quote unquote, would be just running its own affairs. So I definitely don't think that this can be a solution. However, I do believe that decentralization and sort of breaking down the Beirut-centric structure of the state and allowing people at the city level, not necessarily at sort of a sectarian geographical level, to run their own affairs is a way out. But as Joe pointed out, I think that if we start thinking about the solution as a set of standalone measures, let's say deconfessionalization or decentralization on its own, there's a lot of room for co-optation by sectarian forces that are able to impose a de facto reality on the ground and then, in a sense, manipulate and make use of this new arrangement. So this is not, in my opinion, a way out. The way out is a new social contract, is a new package. And this goes back to something that I'd like to bring up very quickly. I know we're running out of time, which is how to create today a de facto reality that, in a sense, liberates us and ourselves from this dead end or this extremely gloomy picture that Joe has depicted, rightfully so. If I go back 10 years ago in 2009, when the AUB Secular Club was created, and then in 2011, where the first demonstration, Isqat al-Nizam Ta'ifi, were launched, not only we were considered not political, so not even within the framework of politics, it was considered as something that has absolutely no way in imposing itself as a mainstream alternative. 10 years from now, we succeeded in one thing and failed in the other. I think we succeeded in the battle of ideas, in mainstreamizing our discourse, and imposing the kullun yani kullun in its most naive and its most powerful aspect, and really showing that, demonstrating in a sense, that there was no longer a room for this system to be fixed as it used to be in the past. So that's a huge victory. And that's a victory that was done without money, without structures, without party, without charismatic leaders, and in only 10 years, while the country and everything around us was sort of falling apart, while the Arab uprising were being butchered. So with all the wrong signals, right? There was a de facto reality that was imposed and that culminated into 17th of October with what I believe is a popular awareness among a large chunk of society that what brings us together in terms of material interest, in terms of our livelihood, our right to live decently in this country, is way more than the sectarian myth that basically the framework is the sect. The second thing I want to bring out, what we failed to do is to really impose a material de facto reality where this vision can actually materialize in politics. And I believe that today the entry point is not necessarily elections and not necessarily a constitutional process to change the regime, but it's actually something that's happening in front of our eyes and that just needs, in my opinion, to be built on and politicized. After the 4th of August, when people went down to Jemaiz Mankhal Karantina Jaytawi and said, we are the state, right? This is not a slogan. This is a direct translation of a new form of political organizing that is building solidarity structures between people that are recreating alternatives to both the clientelist sectarian state, based on which a lot of people used to depend, and also the market, which has completely collapsed, based on which another half of the population was sort of dependent. In addition to that, they are creating a structure of direct governance. A lot of decisions are being taken, even if they're the most basic one about neighborhood, about buildings, about stuff like that. I'm not saying that to just extrapolate or amplify an epiphenomenon, but I'm saying that there's an entry point today, which is undermined and in my opinion, can be extremely promising, which is self-organizing, which is making use of the weakest point today of the sectarian regime, which is a total failure to provide livelihood, both through the clientist network and through the market, which is basically what the middle class was relying on. By recreating structures of solidarity and transforming these structures at the local level into maybe political structures of self-governance that can later on translate into more a decentralized political framework. I hope I made myself clear because I was trying to speak fast, but I think that there's another way also at looking at political change that doesn't go through the institutional route.
Well, thank you. That means, that luckily means we're ending on a note of optimism. I was going to ask as wrapping up comments, for you to tell me whether you have, if there's any, is there any hope? This is the question all Lebanese I meet ask, is there any hope? Do we have hope? Instead of answering the question, just raise your hands if you have hope, and you can put your thumbs down if you don't. Hand raising, please.
Finger, not full.
Okay, everybody has hope. That's good to hear. I think that's
some hope, Liz.
That's what's needed in Lebanon right now. Thank you very much, everybody, for fascinating comments and insights. And I hope everybody who's watching learned a lot. I certainly did.
Thank you, Liz.
Very much.
Very much.
Thanks, everyone.